The command center in the Allied sector near the Rhine was a cavern of thick smoke, frantic radio static, and the suffocating scent of damp wool and old maps. General Eisenhower's staff stared at the blue lines on the topographic charts, knowing that the Rhine was not just a river, but the final, jagged tooth of the German defense. Intelligence had recovered a set of decrypted codes that could end the war months earlier, but the window to act was closing with every tick of the clock. The communication lines were severed, and the bridges were either blown or guarded by heavy artillery that would shred any conventional crossing attempt. They needed someone who could move like a ghost and survive like a wolf. A man capable of navigating the freezing, churning currents of the most contested river in Europe. Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne stood in the corner of the room, his uniform devoid of the colourful ribbons that decorated the chests of the officers, yet his presence commanded a different kind of silence. A veteran of the early elite maritime units that would later pave the way for the Navy SEALs, Thorne was a man forged in the salt and blood of the Pacific before being reassigned to the European theatre for his unique expertise. He listened to the mission briefing, a desperate 24-hour window to deliver the intelligence to a forward observation post on the eastern bank. The officers spoke of high risks and low survival rates, their voices trembling with the weight of the men they had already lost. Thorne did not look at the maps. He looked at the water levels and the cloud cover, calculating the speed of the current against the strength of his own lungs. When the general asked for a volunteer, the silence that followed was heavy with the realization that this was a one-way trip through a labyrinth of mines and MG-42 nests. Thorne stepped forward, his boots clicking softly on the wooden floor, and simply nodded, accepting the leather pouch containing the documents. He didn't ask for a squad or a distraction. He asked for a darkened kayak, a combat knife, and a silenced pistol. He knew that in the water, a group was a target, but a single man was a ripple that the enemy might mistake for the wind. The mission was officially logged as a suicide run, a footnote in a war of millions. But for Thorne, it was a mathematical problem of endurance and timing. The preparation was silent and methodical, a ritual Thorne had performed 100 times in the shadows of coastal raids. He blackened his face with cork and oil, checked the seals on his waterproof gear, and tested the weight of the intelligence pouch against his chest. Around him, the regular infantry watched with a mixture of awe and pity, seeing a man preparing for his own funeral. The air was biting, a precursor to the freezing fog that was beginning to roll off the surface of the Rhine. Thorne checked his watch. The countdown had begun, and he had exactly 23 hours and 40 minutes to reach the coordinates. As he reached the muddy banks of the western shore, the sheer scale of the Rhine loomed before him like a moving wall of obsidian. The water was high, fed by the spring melt and the heavy rains, swirling with debris and hidden snags that could puncture a hull or trap a swimmer. On the far side, the silhouettes of skeletal trees and ruined fortifications stood guard, occasionally illuminated by the flicker of a distant flare. Thorne pushed the kayak into the shallows, the freezing water immediately seeping into his boots, reminding him that the environment was as much an enemy as the Germans. He took a deep breath, tasting the iron and salt of the river, and pushed off into the dark. The first few hundred yards were a game of agonizing patience, paddling with slow, rhythmic strokes that minimized the splash. Every time a German spotlight swept the surface, Thorne froze, becoming part of the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The current was stronger than the intelligence reports had suggested, pulling him downstream toward a bend where the enemy presence was densest. He had to fight the river's momentum without making the rhythmic noise that would alert the acoustic sensors buried along the banks. His shoulders began to burn with the first signs of fatigue, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing only on the rhythm of the water. Halfway across, the sound of a patrol boat's engine rumbled through the fog, a low, guttural vibration that Thorne felt in his teeth. He slipped out of the kayak, tethering it to his wrist, and submerged himself until only his eyes and nose remained above the waterline. The boat passed so close he could smell the diesel exhaust and hear the muffled laughter of the German sailors. The freezing water felt like 1,000 needles piercing his skin, threatening to trigger the involuntary gasp that leads to drowning. He waited until the red glow of their cigarettes faded into the mist before climbing back into his craft, his limbs already beginning to stiffen. The terrain on the eastern bank was a nightmare of jagged rocks and tangled wire, designed to snag anyone who survived the water. Thorn steered the kayak into a small, overgrown inlet, hiding the craft under a pile of dead branches and mud. He was now in enemy territory, miles behind the front lines, with nothing but his training and a ticking clock to guide him. His legs felt like lead as he climbed the muddy embankment, his breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts to avoid the telltale white plumes in the cold air. He checked his compass. He was 3 miles off course due to the current, and the sun would be up in 6 hours. Moving through the dense woods, Thorn encountered the first signs of the German interior defense, a series of tripwires linked to signal flares. He moved with the precision of a surgeon, stepping over the thin wires with agonizing slowness, his eyes scanning the forest floor for the glint of a buried mine. The physical toll of the crossing was starting to manifest as a deep, rhythmic throb in his temples, a warning sign of impending hypothermia. He bit the inside of his cheek to stay focused, the copper taste of blood grounding him in the reality of the mission. He was a shadow among shadows, a ghost in a land that wanted him dead. By the time the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the canopy, Thorn reached the edge of a small clearing overlooking the secondary German supply line. He could see the convoys moving in the distance, oblivious to the man watching them from the brush. He was exhausted, his body shivering uncontrollably, but the objective was less than 5 miles away. He adjusted the straps on his pack, felt the reassuring weight of the intelligence pouch, and prepared for the final, most dangerous leg of the journey. The mission was half over, but the hardest part, the survival of the day, was just beginning. As the sun climbed higher, the forest transformed from a sanctuary of shadows into a brightly lit trap. Thorn found himself pinned down in a narrow ravine as a German search party combed the area, their dogs barking at a scent that was dangerously close to his position. He lay flat against the frozen earth, covered in a layer of pine needles and dirt, holding his breath until his lungs felt like they were going to burst. The lead soldier passed within 5 feet of him, the hem of his greatcoat brushing the very bush Thorn was hiding under. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated tension, where the difference between life and a shallow grave was a single twitch of a muscle. The psychological weight of the mission began to settle in, a heavy mantle of isolation that few men could endure. Thorn was alone in a world that had forgotten his existence, carrying information that could save thousands of lives, yet he was utterly expendable. He thought of the men he had served with, the faces of those who had vanished beneath the waves of the Pacific, and the silent promise he had made to keep moving until he couldn't. This wasn't about glory or medals. It was about the cold, hard logic of duty in a world gone mad. His mind drifted to the logistics of the intelligence he carried, troop movements, fuel depots, and the vulnerabilities of the Siegfried Line. By midday, the hunger began to gnaw at his stomach, a sharp, acidic reminder that he hadn't eaten in nearly 20 hours. He had a small ration tin, but the sound of opening it would be like a gunshot in the silent woods. Instead, he chewed on a piece of bitter hemlock bark to stimulate saliva and focused on the map burned into his memory. The route ahead required him to cross an open meadow that was overlooked by a stone farmhouse, likely occupied by an enemy observation post. There was no way around it without adding hours to his journey, hours he did not have if he was to meet the deadline. He watched the farmhouse for 2 hours, noting the patterns of the guards and the timing of their rotations. He saw a young German soldier, barely a teenager, sitting on the porch cleaning a rifle, looking tired and homesick. For a moment, Thorn saw the humanity in the enemy, a mirror of the exhaustion he felt in his own bones. But the empathy was quickly suppressed by the cold necessity of the mission. That boy was an obstacle, and the farmhouse was a target. Thorn waited for a cloud to obscure the sun, casting a long, sweeping shadow across the meadow, and began to crawl. The crawl was a grueling exercise in core strength and patience, dragging his body inch by inch through the tall, dead grass. His elbows were raw and bleeding, and the intelligence pouch felt like a lead weight pressing into his chest. Every time a bird flew overhead or the wind whistled through the eaves of the house, he froze, his hand hovering over the hilt of his knife. He could hear the muffled voices of the soldiers inside, the smell of cooking sausage wafting toward him, a cruel irony for a man starving in the mud. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the tree line on the far side, his heart racing with the adrenaline of the near miss. As he pushed deeper into the occupied zone, Thorn realized the German presence was much larger than the Allied intelligence had estimated. He saw hidden flak batteries and camouflaged tiger tanks tucked away in the barns of local farmers, a sleeping giant waiting to strike the Allied crossing. This information was now just as vital as the documents he carried, and the pressure to survive intensified. If he fell now, the Allies would be walking into a slaughterhouse. The mission had evolved from a simple delivery to a desperate race to warn his superiors of the trap that awaited them. The physical exhaustion was now reaching a critical point, with his vision beginning to blur and his coordination slipping. He found himself stumbling over routes he should have seen, his movements becoming sluggish and heavy. He knew the signs of total systemic failure. His body was cannibalizing itself for energy, and his core temperature was dropping. He stopped for a moment, leaning against a damp oak tree, and forced himself to perform a mental check of his surroundings. He had to stay awake. To sleep now was to die, either by the cold or by the hands of a passing patrol. In the late afternoon, he encountered a small stream that fed into the Rhine, its waters clear and deceptively deep. As he prepared to cross, he saw a group of local villagers being interrogated by a Gestapo officer near a stone bridge. The cruelty was casual and efficient, a stark reminder of the regime he was fighting against. Thorn watched from the tall grass, his hand tightening on his pistol, the urge to intervene warring with the absolute necessity of his mission. He had to remain a ghost, even if it meant witnessing the horrors of war without lifting a finger to stop them. The moral weight of his inaction felt heavier than the physical fatigue. He detoured around the bridge, wading through the freezing stream where the water reached his waist. The current nearly swept him away, his weakened legs struggling to find purchase on the slippery stones. He emerged on the other side, shivering violently, his teeth chattering so loudly he had to bite down on a piece of leather to keep quiet. He was now within 2 miles of the extraction point, a derelict church on the outskirts of a bombed-out village. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The final mile was a blur of pain and sheer willpower, a man moving on instinct rather than thought. He was no longer Elias Thorn, the veteran operator. He was a vessel for the intelligence he carried, a machine built for a single purpose. He reached the ruins of the church as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky. The silhouette of the shattered bell tower, a grim monument against the horizon. He checked his watch one last time. 22 hours and 15 minutes since he had left the western bank. He had made it, but the village was crawling with enemy patrols, and the contact was nowhere to be seen. The interior of the church smelled of ancient dust and the sharp, metallic tang of spent shell casings. Thorn collapsed behind a fallen stone altar, his lungs burning as he tried to regulate his breathing in the thin, cold air. He was supposed to meet a resistance contact named Marcel, but the silence in the ruins was absolute, save for the whistling wind. Suddenly a floorboard creaked behind him, and Thorn spun around, his pistol raised, only to find himself staring into the eyes of a terrified woman holding a rusted bayonet. She was gaunt, her clothes rags, and her eyes reflected the hollowed-out soul of a civilian who had lost everything to the occupation. "Marcel is dead," she whispered in broken English, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "The SS took him this morning. They know someone is coming." The words hit Thorne like a physical blow, shattering the thin veneer of hope he had maintained. The mission was compromised, the extraction point was burned, and he was trapped in a village surrounded by enemy forces with no way out. The intelligence he carried was now a death warrant, and for the first time in his career, Thorne felt the cold grip of genuine despair. He looked at the woman and saw the end of his journey in her haunted gaze. Outside, the sound of truck engines and shouting soldiers erupted, the village suddenly coming alive with the light of torches and headlights. The Germans were conducting a house-to-house search, closing the net around the church with systematic efficiency. Thorne knew he couldn't hide forever, and the woman would be executed if he were found with her. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small incendiary device, intending to destroy the intelligence before he was captured. But as his fingers brushed the leather pouch, the weight of the thousands of lives it represented stopped him. He couldn't let them die in the dark. "Is there another way to the river?" Thorne asked, his voice a hoarse rasp. The woman looked at him, then at the flickering light of the torches reflecting off the stained glass fragments. She pointed to a heavy wooden trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of rubble, leading to a series of drainage tunnels that emptied into the Rhine's lower basin. It was a desperate gamble, a claustrophobic maze that could easily become a tomb, but it was the only path left. As the front doors of the church were kicked open, Thorne shoved the woman toward the back exit and dived into the darkness of the cellar, the sound of gunfire echoing above him. The tunnels were narrow, slick with slime and icy runoff, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Thorne crawled on his belly, his flashlight dimmed to a sliver of light, his heart drumming a frantic rhythm against the stone floor. He could hear the muffled thuds of grenades detonating in the church above, the shockwaves vibrating through the earth and rattling his teeth. The physical confinement triggered a primal claustrophobia he hadn't felt since his training, a sense that the world was shrinking until there was only him and the suffocating dark. He was losing blood from a gash on his forehead, the warm liquid blurring his vision. He reached a junction where the tunnel split into 3 directions, none of them marked on his mental map. He chose the one that slanted downward, hoping it led to the river, but after 100 yards, he found the path blocked by a collapsed section of the ceiling. He was trapped, the oxygen in the small space beginning to thin, the silence of the tunnel pressing in on him like a physical weight. He began to dig with his bare hands, his fingernails tearing against the jagged rocks, a frantic, animalistic urge to survive driving him forward. Every stone he moved seemed to bring 2 more down in its place, a Sisyphean struggle in the bowels of the earth. In the darkness, the ghosts of his past began to crowd the tunnel, the voices of men he couldn't save whispering in his ears. He saw his mother's face, the sun-drenched fields of his youth, and the cold blue eyes of the first man he had ever killed. The line between reality and exhaustion-induced delirium was beginning to fray, his mind fracturing under the sheer weight of the mission's failure. He screamed into the dark, a silent, internal roar of frustration and pain, before his hands finally broke through to a pocket of fresh air. He pulled himself through the narrow gap, his uniform shredded and his body battered, emerging into a larger chamber where the sound of rushing water greeted him. The tunnel emptied out into a rocky grotto just above the waterline of the Rhine, but the view was far from a relief. A German patrol boat was anchored just yards away, its searchlight scanning the very spot where Thorne emerged. He flattened himself against the wet stone, the spray from the river soaking through his clothes, his body shivering so violently he feared he would lose his grip. He was out of time, out of options, and nearly out of strength. The intelligence pouch was still there, a mocking reminder of a goal that now seemed impossible to achieve. A sudden flare ignited the sky, a brilliant, blinding white that illuminated the entire riverbank. The Germans had spotted something, perhaps the woman from the church, or perhaps just a shadow, and began raking the shoreline with heavy machine gun fire. The bullets sparked against the rocks inches from Thorne's head, the deafening roar of the MG-42s drowning out the sound of the river. He realized then that he wouldn't be able to paddle back. He would have to swim. In the freezing, turbulent waters of the Rhine, at night and under fire, it was a death sentence. Thorne didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. He took a final deep breath, tied the intelligence pouch to his belt with a double knot, and threw himself into the black maw of the river. The impact was like hitting a brick wall, the cold stealing the air from his lungs and the current immediately dragging him under. He fought to stay afloat, his limbs moving in slow motion as the water sapped the last of his heat. Above him, the surface of the water was riddled with the traces of machine gun fire, a deadly light show that marked his path through the abyss. He was no longer a man. He was a piece of driftwood, at the mercy of a river that cared nothing for his mission or his life. The crossing back was not a swim. It was a desperate struggle against drowning that lasted for what felt like centuries. Thorne was swept miles downstream, his body bouncing off submerged rocks and tangled in the debris of war. He lost his pistol, his pack, and his boots, but his hand never left the intelligence pouch. By the time he clawed his way onto the western bank, he was deep in the throes of advanced hypothermia, his skin a ghostly blue, and his mind drifting in and out of consciousness. He lay in the mud for a long time, the rain washing the blood from his face, unable to move a single finger. He was found at dawn by an Allied scout patrol, a shivering, unrecognizable wreck of a man huddled in the reeds. They initially thought he was a German saboteur and held him at gunpoint, but when he croaked out the recognition codes and pointed to the pouch, the atmosphere changed instantly. He was rushed to a field hospital, but Thorne refused to let go of the documents until a high-ranking intelligence officer arrived. He sat on the edge of a cot, wrapped in thermal blankets, his eyes vacant and staring at some point in the distance that only he could see. The mission was over, but the man who had started it was gone, replaced by a hollow shell. The intelligence Thorne delivered was a bombshell, revealing the exact coordinates of the German counter-offensive and the hidden bridgehead. Within hours, the Allied artillery began a massive bombardment that pulverized the German positions he had seen from the farmhouse. The sounds of the distant explosions reached the hospital, a low, rhythmic thumping that made Thorne flinch with every blast. He saw the wounded being brought in, men far younger than him with far worse injuries, and felt a crushing sense of survivor's guilt. He had done his duty, but the cost was etched into the lines of his face and the permanent tremor in his hands. Word of his feat began to spread through the command structure, moving from captains to colonels and eventually to the supreme Allied commander. The story of a man who crossed the Rhine twice in less than 24 hours, alone and under fire, was the kind of legend the weary troops needed. But Thorne wanted no part of the celebration. He stayed in his darkened room, speaking only when spoken to, his voice a ghost of its former self. He had seen the face of the enemy, the face of the innocent, and the cold indifference of the river, and he found no glory in any of it. He was a man who had looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was part of him. 2 days later, a black staff car arrived at the field hospital, bearing the markings of the British High Command. Thorne was told to dress in a clean uniform and prepare for a visitor of the highest importance. He moved like an automaton, his body still aching with every step, his mind unable to process the gravity of the situation. He was led to a small, private briefing room where a heavy scent of cigar smoke and expensive brandy hung in the air. At the center of the room sat Winston Churchill, his iconic frame hunched over a map, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. The room was filled with generals and aides, all of them standing at rigid attention, but Churchill didn't look up immediately. He continued to study the map, his fingers tracing the very route Thorn had taken across the river. The silence was deafening, a vacuum of expectation that made the air feel heavy. Thorn stood at the back of the room, his eyes fixed on the floor, feeling like an intruder in a world of giants. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had barely survived a nightmare and was now being asked to relive it for the entertainment of the powerful. Finally, Churchill looked up, his sharp, watery eyes piercing through the gloom to find Thorn. He didn't offer a handshake or a smile. He simply stared at the veteran for a long, uncomfortable minute. He saw the raw skin on Thorn's neck, the hollowed-out cheeks, and the way the man's hands were clasped tightly behind his back to hide the shaking. Churchill knew men, and he knew the specific look of a man who had been pushed past the breaking point and had somehow managed to stitch himself back together. The Prime Minister took a long pull from his cigar, the tip glowing a fierce orange in the dim light. "They tell me you crossed the Rhine in 24 hours, Churchill said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the room. "They tell me you did it alone, with nothing but a knife and your wits." Thorn didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. The generals around the table looked expectant, waiting for a grand statement or a humble deflection, but Thorn remained silent. He was thinking of the woman in the church, the boy on the porch, and the freezing black water that still felt like it was inside his lungs. He was waiting for the ceremony to end, so he could go back to the silence of his room. The tension in the room grew until it was almost physical, the officers shifting uncomfortably in their polished boots. Churchill stood up, leaning heavily on his cane, and walked toward Thorn with a slow, deliberate pace. He stopped inches away, the smell of tobacco and power radiating from him. He looked at Thorn's eyes, searching for the spark that had driven him across that river, and found only the cold ash of endurance. Churchill leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Thorn and the closest officers could hear. Everyone expected a speech about the indomitable spirit of the Allies, or a soaring tribute to the brave men of the special units. They expected the kind of rhetoric that had sustained a nation through the Blitz and the dark days of 1940. But Churchill was a man who understood the economy of words and the weight of true sacrifice. He knew that for a man like Thorn, praise was a burden and medals were just metal. He cleared his throat, the sound like dry leaves skittering on a tombstone, and prepared to deliver his verdict on the mission. The Prime Minister's eyes never wavered from Thorn's face as he spoke the words that would eventually become a whisper in the halls of Hereford and Fort Bragg for decades. He didn't shout, he didn't offer a grandiloquent toast. He simply said, "Most men seek to make history, Sergeant. You simply made it look like a duty. If the Rhine had a soul, it would be screaming your name in terror." The room remained frozen, the weight of the statement sinking into the minds of the officers. It was not a compliment to Thorn's skill, but an acknowledgement of his sheer, terrifying resolve, a recognition that he had conquered nature and the enemy through a force of will that was almost monstrous. Thorn felt a strange, cold shiver run down his spine, not from the cold of the river, but from the realization that this man truly understood what he had done. Churchill wasn't praising his heroism. He was acknowledging the darkness required to survive such a journey. The Prime Minister turned back to his map, the interaction over as quickly as it had begun, leaving Thorn to be ushered out of the room by the silent aides. As the door closed, Thorn caught one last glimpse of Churchill lighting a new cigar, the smoke rising like the fog over the Rhine, a silent sentinel of a world built on the backs of men like him. In the weeks that followed, the intelligence Thorn provided led to the definitive collapse of the German Western Front. The war moved quickly, leaving the story of the lone swimmer behind as the world focused on the fall of Berlin and the eventual peace. Thorn was offered a commission and a chest full of medals, But he turned them all down, requesting only a quiet discharge and a ticket back to the States. He didn't want to be a symbol. He didn't want to be the man who crossed the Rhine. He wanted to find a place where the sound of rushing water didn't make him reach for a knife he no longer carried. He returned to a small coastal town in Maine, a place of cold Atlantic winds and grey granite cliffs that reminded him of the river without the blood. He took a job as a lighthouse keeper, living a life of solitude and routine that kept the ghosts at bay. He rarely spoke of the war, and to his neighbors he was just a quiet, disciplined man who kept his grounds impeccable and his lights burning bright. But sometimes, on the coldest nights of the year, he would stand on the edge of the cliffs and look out at the dark water, feeling the phantom itch of the leather pouch against his chest. Years passed, and the Navy SEALs were officially formed, drawing on the traditions and lessons of men like Thorne. His mission became a classified case study, a template for underwater infiltration and long-range reconnaissance. Younger operators would read the redacted reports and wonder about the man who had done the impossible in the mud of 1945. They knew the quote from Churchill, often framed in the halls of their training centers, but few knew the name of the man it was addressed to. Thorne had become a myth, a shadow that moved through the foundation of their brotherhood. One day, a young naval officer tracked him down to the lighthouse, seeking a mentor or perhaps just a piece of the legend. He found Thorne sitting on a bench overlooking the sea, his hair white and his hands finally still. The officer asked him what it was like to hear those words from Churchill, expecting a story of pride or a moment of profound realization. Thorne looked at the young man, his eyes still possessing that same piercing clarity that had stared down the Prime Minister decades ago, and simply shrugged. "The words didn't change the river," Thorne said, his voice thin but steady. "They didn't make the water warmer or the climb easier. They were just words spoken by a man in a dry room while I was still wet to the bone." The young officer seemed disappointed, looking for a romanticism that Thorne had long since discarded. But as he turned to leave, Thorne added one last thing. "The only thing that matters is that when I was in the middle of that water, I didn't stop. Churchill knew that. That's all he was saying." Thorne lived to see the end of the century, a witness to a world that had moved on from the brutality of his youth. When he finally passed away, he left no journals, no memoirs, and no grand speeches. He left only a small, weathered leather pouch in a safe deposit box, containing a copy of his discharge papers and a single handwritten note from a British secretary transcribing the Prime Minister's remark. He had lived his life with the same quiet precision he had used to cross the Rhine, a man who understood that true legacy isn't written in gold, but in the silent fulfillment of an impossible task. At his funeral, a small group of men in civilian suits stood at the back of the cemetery, their posture and eyes giving away their profession. They didn't speak to the family, and they didn't stay for the wake. They simply laid a single polished stone from the banks of the Rhine on his headstone and vanished back into the shadows. They were the heirs to his trade, the men who lived in the spaces between history, and for them, Elias Thorne was the standard by which all courage was measured. As the sun set over the Maine coast, the light from the tower began its slow, rhythmic sweep across the waves. It was a beacon of consistency in a world of chaos, a silent reminder that even in the darkest night, there are those who will cross any distance to bring the light. The river had long since washed away his footprints, but the weight of his resolve remained, a permanent ripple in the fabric of time. What Churchill said was not for the world to hear. It was for one man to know that his struggle had been seen, and that was enough.